this is the second presentation for the Grand Valley Fluvial Hazard Zone Mapping Project. We did a kickoff meeting back in August where we talked about what the process is and what it entails, what is a fluvial hazard zone. And if you missed that, I'll make sure to send out a link to the recording of that presentation, as well as we have a little video that we made with the state. It's like 8 minutes that kind of goes over the program and what it is and how we use it. So we'll get those materials out to you all in a follow-up email from this. So I'm Joel Schultes with Colorado Mesa University and Wash Engineering, and then Molly Guinea with Cedar Geomorphic is my partner in this, and she's been doing a lot of the mapping work and is going to talk about that in the middle of the presentation. So today we're going to talk about where we've gone over the past couple months, the mapping that we've done, what we've learned about the river system and how it moves over time and what that means. And so we'll start off with a kind of brief history of the rivers in the Grand Valley that Molly's going to kick us off with. I'll talk a little bit about the hydrology and how that plays out with migration. We'll get into a little bit of review about what fluvial hazard zone mapping is and how it's playing out in the Grand Valley and some applications of that, potential applications. Molly will then go over the draft maps, which we have available on a web map. And she'll kind of discuss what that is. And then we'll talk about next steps and kind of the comment process and follow-up meetings with you all. But before we start, any thoughts or questions up front? All right, well, we will get it going and try to get you out here before an hour passes. So a little bit about the sponsors here. This is being funded through the Colorado Water Conservation Board. It's our fiscal sponsor of this is Rivers Edge West, and the Colorado Fluvial Hazard Zone Program is part of CWCB, and you can find more about it on this website. Scan that or go to the website. A lot of good other additional resources that I'll make sure to share with you all. So we'll start off with the story of the Grand Valley Rivers, and I'll let Molly take it away.
Cool, thanks, Joel. Yeah, so we can quick talk about the really long ago history, maybe a little bit of the geologic history just to get us started. So the Grand Valley is located on the Colorado Plateau physiogeographic region, right? So previous history was a lot of, mountain building and then compression and lots of faulting and folding. And so you get this really cool landscape in the semi-arid, arid region, right, of all these canyons. And yeah, Grand Valley is part of that, which is really cool. But in the semi-recent history of the Grand Valley rivers, there was some glacial influence here. So while the Grand Valley remained relatively unglaciated, as far as we know, there was a large influx of sediment coming upstream from everywhere that was glaciated, right? So all of this sediment was washing out into the Grand Valley, and the Gunnison and the Colorado had to work through all of this sediment. So in the left photo there, that is a photo from the early 1900s of the Colorado River, and you can see there's this old terrace, and that's kind of an old signifier of that period when the rivers were eroding into all of this alluvium, all of this outwash sediment, and creating these inset floodplains. And you can still see a lot of these terraces today throughout the area. On the right there is just a little geologic map, kind of showing there's a few different geologic units in there, but the QALC 1 and 2, they're both kind of that alluvium that the river's been working through, and that's kind of more of the modern inset floodplain, whereas that up north on that image, the QAC is more of that like alluvium, colluvium stuff where the river's not really active up there anymore. That's more of the terrace material.
All right, let's see if we can get the slide to advance. There we go.
Cool. And so that's a bit about like the you know, really long ago history, but in order to really think about the river now, we want to think about, you know, kind of the geomorphic setting, the geomorphic trajectory of the Grand Valley. And so one way to think about it is kind of separating the reaches that we have. We have 10 reaches on the Colorado and 3 reaches on the Gunnison. It's useful to kind of think about how geomorphic setting and processes are different between like confined canyon-y type reaches versus valley and unconfined reaches. So in these canyon or kind of confined reaches, such as up in the Debec Canyon, kind of by the Loma boat ramp, parts of the Gunnison, right? These reaches are, you know, narrower. The channels are largely single thread, right? They're narrower, potentially a deeper main channel. And often they have a narrower floodplain. So there's a little less, you know, potentially less floodplain connectivity, but also just a narrower floodplain because there's this greater, you know, hill slope channel connectivity. Basically, the valley margins are confining that valley and confining where the river can move. So there is still, you know, in these areas, there are still areas of, you know, high floodplain connectivity or, you know, some of this like physical complexity with islands and bars and things. But, you know, it's much less than what you would assume with, you know, some of these more unconfined regions that I'll talk about in a second. And so all of that kind of points to this idea of this transport reach. So if you think about how sediment is moving through a system, basically in these reaches where the channel is basically just one channel, the gradient, the slope of the area is pretty steep, and the flow can't really, you know, dissipate on those floodplains because the floodplains are relatively narrow. Like the flow doesn't have a lot of place to go to. Basically, that sediment isn't going to be depositing there, right? There's too much energy in that system. So that sediment is going to be transported downstream. Next slide. Okay, in comparison, we've got more of these unconfined, you know, valley reaches. So you can think of more of like the Grand Valley in general. And so these reaches are, you know, characteristic of wider, shallower channels potentially. You know, maybe they are a little bit of an anastomosing or multi-thread, maybe a little bit of a messier channel. And they're often associated with a little more complex or wider floodplains, a little better floodplain connectivity. And so basically, you know, the flows can inundate those floodplains, right? There's also a gentler slope than, you know, maybe those confined canyon reaches. And the valley margins aren't necessarily, you know, restricting this reach as much, right? The river has a little bit more space to move, which is why, you know, the floodplain might be a little wider. And so, you know, while the confined reaches are typically more transport reaches, right? They're transporting that sediment downstream. These reaches are more depositional in nature. So because, you know, that flow is transporting the sediment in those transport reaches, then it opens up into this wider valley, you know, wider floodplain. And so that flow can, you know, go across that floodplain, use all that area, kind of the energy dissipates and that sediment can be deposited. And that coarse sediment is really important in this system for, you know, keeping those floodplains connected and, you know, making this system pretty complex. Yeah, and so, I mean, thinking about all of this, you know, while I said the unconfined reaches, you know, are generally more complex, they have wider floodplains, right? You know, even to a little extent, the confined reaches are, you know, somewhat complex in some areas, right, where they can be. And so historically, you know, this watershed, these rivers are complex and dynamic. You know, rivers are not static. And these rivers have definitely moved in their past and continue to move today. And, you know, they create a lot of complexity while they do that. As the sediment is deposited, particularly in these more depositional areas, right? This coarse sediment is, you know, creating ultimately, these interactions with that core sediment deposition is creating, a lot of new forms like, side channels, or just like a multi-thread plan form, floodplain, like overbank chutes, and just like some really complex microtopography on the floodplain. You can get bars and islands forming. Yeah, and this is all very important as, it's just very important. Yeah, no, go ahead, Joel.
Okay.
Yeah, so here are just a few examples of that dynamism within these systems. So on the left here, you might have seen this in our last presentation, but it's such a great example. It's near the Redlands Parkway, I believe. And so on the left here is this example of a meander bend migrating between 1937 and 1986. So this is a pretty natural process in these rivers, right? So, you get over time, you have kind of this erosion on the outer bank of meander and deposition on the inner bend, creating this little point bar. But over time that migrates, and that is a pretty natural situation. On the right-hand side of the screen, we've got two examples here just showing the complexity in these systems. Like you can see, sorry, oh, okay. So on the right, yeah, you can just see the fluvial signatures there of where the river has been.
No development going on there. That's good. G road construction. Yeah, G road.
Mute.
No,
Rick, were you making a comment?
23.5 and 24 there is. That is Daring Carey Energy Homes, and he's building.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead. We'll just go ahead and mute. Okay. Let's see, Molly. Okay.
And Raleigh, I do have a question. Is there anything updated since 1986, or what's the impact of, I assume, armoring of the Redlands Parkway? Is that going to involve stuff back over, or what happened with the floods early in, I think, like 2012 was the last high water year?
Yeah, you can see the imagery underneath it is the contemporary imagery. So it's and we'll talk about that a little bit later about kind of like when the river interacts with this hard points, kind of what happens. But yeah, essentially the river's been slowing down, but it's eventually, and we've also had bank armoring here to arrest that migration.
Yeah, good question. But yeah, so on the right, those are just two more examples of just the complexity. You can see it, on the bottom right-hand photo, there's like meander cutoffs. You can see maybe old side channels that may be still reactivated during floods, just like general multi-thread channels, bars and islands. There's also probably a really interesting, ecological complexity with this, because physical complexity can allow for different types of vegetation and ecosystems to thrive. So yeah, it's, these systems are historically pretty dynamic, which is really cool. Yeah, and so this complexity, this physical complexity is kind of sustained by the freedom to move. The river needs to be able to move to do this. And so, you can see in the confined canyon reaches, the river doesn't have a lot of space to move, right? So there is a little bit of complexity, maybe an island or a bar here or there, but it's not as free to do its thing, right? And you also need flooding. So John Pitlick from CU Boulder, he did a few studies back in the day in the 90s, looking at how flooding impacts this complexity, this physical complexity. And he found that a lot of the sediment that initiates this complexity is kind of this coarser sediment, and that coarser sediment requires flows that are generally at or greater than bank full flows, which are equated to about 1.5 to 2 year flows. And so it's really important for that flooding to occur to maintain this physical complexity. And so it just highlights the importance of the hydrologic regime in this. And then, of course, it's also important to note that, complexity and dynamism can also create and sustain habitats. So not only is there physical complexity, but there can be ecological complexity. And, as I had mentioned, that the physical complexity can help, provide, a variety of, opportunities for riparian vegetation. We have some endangered species in the Grand Valley, right? Or threatened species, particularly fish, like the humpback chub and the razorback. And so these species, there's been a lot of work looking at, where these species thrive, or what they need to thrive. And a lot of these reports from the 90s and early 2000s found that these fish kind of require some of that complexity to proceed in their life cycles. So yeah, it's an important thing. Yeah.
So I'll jump in and now talk about where the river is today, which is still, I would say, a complex system. Complex not only within the river corridor and the floodplain and kind of these islands and side channels that Molly talked about, but also with all the kind of new infrastructure and development and redevelopment along the riverfront that's come into play. So here's just a little snapshot of downtown where a lot of redevelopment action is occurring. And I'm just highlighting some of all the things that happen in the river corridor, that exist in the river corridor. And that could be related to the river itself, that could be human infrastructure that we build, or infrastructure like these armored banks that we put in for various reasons, right? Constructed habitat, et cetera. So it's a very complicated picture now, which makes for complex management approaches. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the different processes that are playing out when we think about this dynamism and complexity that Molly was talking about, and processes of bank erosion and bar deposition and island formation. What does that look like when it interacts with hard points that we create along the river? And so I've got a couple examples here. One is an example that's near connected lakes. So that's on the left. And I'm just going to get my little laser pointer out here. Here we have a river splits, and we've got some islands that formed. And we've got a really kind of funky hydraulic zone. If anyone's floated down here, you kind of go in another world when you take the left channel here. You get kind of slammed up against the wall. There's some Russian olive that take you. There's a little bit of a ledge that's been exposed of bedrock. And then depending on the river flows, the hydraulics can be really funky here. I've known people to get capsized in this area because essentially what we've created is a hard point with the dike road and protecting the power line here. And we end up getting kind of funny hydraulic conditions as well as funny erosion conditions. And so this is going to be an area where the river is constantly going to be trying to work within and move through. And as long as we kind of keep fighting that battle, we'll keep fighting it. But this is kind of an area where the river's kind of gone up against. Here's an example where we could be approaching that. This is further upstream. And I'm not going to remember exactly which bridge this is, but I think it might be the 30 Road Bridge. And what we're looking at is just another kind of example where we have a side channel and some outward bank erosion that's probably happening here. And then eventually we might end up meeting this road. And so we can think about applications and follow up with this. What does this mean down the road in the next 10 to 20 years as the river's trying to migrate this way for this infrastructure and this development? Oop, there we go. We have a lot of riverfront development that's happening, and I look forward to speaking with City of Grand Junction and Fruta if they have ideas about riverfront development and how can this play out in a way that is compatible with some of the kind of hazards and processes that we're talking about. I think the Grand Junction sites are in great locations simply because they're kind of away from the active main channel. But when we put these lines down on a map and discuss how they relate and intersect with kind of existing development and active redevelopment, we can have discussions about what does that mean and how could that play out. And finally, don't know if this is final, there's a couple more points, but gravel mining is obviously a big land use and resource extraction within the river corridor. When we mine gravel, we're taking the floodplain out. When we levee the gravel ponds, which is typically the practice, we're retarding or reducing the river's natural tendency to migrate downstream. And so you're essentially taking floodplain habitat out, and the ability of the river to make its way downstream, erode, and then deposit behind it, which then creates that kind of complex habitat that sustains the native fish and whatnot that exist within our rivers. So a little bit about kind of water and sediment. Molly talked about flows mixing with coarse sediments. It's that coarse sediment that is comprised of the banks. It's that coarse sediment that is then deposited, and I'm talking about sand, gravel, and cobble, that's then deposited and makes the islands and bars that create complexity within our river corridor. That sediment comes down from the canyons and interacts with the hydrographs. And what we're seeing here is all the hydrographs that will pass through the stream gauge on the Colorado-Utah state line over the record. And I've got them in blue for pre-2000 and then in orange for post-2000. And then I've got the medians for that. So the black line is the median for everything prior to 2000, and then the red line is from 2000 on. And so we are in a mega drought. We are experiencing climate change, which is reducing our flows, at least over the last 20 years. And so we see a slightly diminished hydrograph that kind of comes off a little bit earlier. So we are certainly seeing reduced flows in the river over the last 20 years. If we look at peak discharges, and so each point is a peak discharge value over the years, and I've got the Colorado River at Cameo, the Gunnison before the confluence near Grand Junction, and then the Colorado River at the Utah state line. And I've got a linear regression trend line through that. So we've got negative trends in the peak of our flows, at least of the two tributaries coming in. And these are significantly negative trends if you do a statistical analysis on it. When you go down to the Utah state line, you see a slight negative trend. It is not statistically significant, at least that slope parameter isn't, but we do see kind of a slight decrease in our flows. However, though flows are reducing, the river is still dynamic, and the city is very aware of this, of Grand Junction, dealing with where it's taken out recently from the 2019 runoff. It took out part of the bike path, and then I understand there was a gas utility through there. And so, the city's had to put some resources into revetting this, armoring this, and building that trail back so we can maintain that community connectivity. So even with and I'll just kind of run some statistics by you, the 2019 flood had a recurrence interval of about 5 years. If you look at the hydrology report that was made by AMEC, and that was based on the downstream gauge there. But if you look at the flow at that gauge, it had a recurrence interval of about 5 years or 20% annual chance probability. If we think about what's the probability of a 2019 runoff event under the hydrologic analysis that AMEC did, which is being used for the updated floodplain mapping project, then just running some stats on this, you have about a 90% chance of experiencing a flood of a similar magnitude over the next 10 years. So this is kind of accumulating the probability over time. 2011, that flood, if I'm remembering the year correctly, I believe it's 2011, that had a recurrence interval of 10 years. So about a 10% chance of happening in a given year. And that has a 65% chance of happening over the next 10 years. And that flood caused some pretty considerable, channel migration and damage as well within the community. So although flows are reducing, we still have a dynamic river and a river that's migrating actively. So that was a little bit on the history of the river. Now I'm going to talk about the fluvial hazard zone and the program in general. So I'll just quickly review what it is, what the components are, and what its applications are. And then we'll talk about how it's played out in the Grand Valley. So a definition for you all: the fluvial hazard zone is an area a stream has occupied in recent history, may occupy or may physically influence as it stores and transports water, sediment, and debris. And so fluvial geomorphic processes, fluvial is river, geomorphology is the form of the earth that rivers make. And so you put those two together and you get river form and process. They can occur gradually, and that's typically what we see in the Grand Valley, is we kind of see this gradual bank erosion and deposition over time, but it can also occur acutely or episodically. When we have a really big runoff here, we can see some considerable bank erosion over time. Here are the components of the fluvial hazard zone. And the main component is going to be the active stream corridor. This is essentially the modern geomorphic floodplain. And we identify this area based on high resolution digital elevation models. So hill shades based on that, relative elevation models, which is identifying different forms and how high they are relative to the river. And then essentially identifying the signatures where the river has created in the recent past or is ongoingly creating. And all those features come together to delineate what's known as the active stream corridor, the floodplain that the river is moving within. We have the fluvial hazard buffer, and this is a buffer off of the active stream corridor that acknowledges that not all of our hazards are at the level of the floodplain. If a river channel erodes into an erodible hill slope, that can cause hill slope failure or just general bank erosion. And so someone who might be considered high and dry and outside of the floodplain could in fact be under the influence of river processes based on this erosion type of process. So that's what the fluvial hazard buffer delineates. And then we have some other components that we'll talk about in a little bit. So the active stream corridor in the Grand Valley. This is a complicated one because we have so much activity and development and mining and infrastructure in the active stream corridor. And so here's just an image of the channel margins over time where the river has been migrating. And then we have areas where we have kind of bank armoring, that's arrested the migration in this area. So this is the South Broadway Bridge. Here's Redlands Parkway. And what we're seeing here, so the yellow line is delineating the active stream corridor, which is the geomorphic floodplain. And what we're seeing here is an area that if the river were left to its own devices, where would it go? Where would it be migrating? And so that's what we're defining here. And that area is essentially where you're going to be encountering active processes of channel migration, bank erosion, deposition. And within that area, kind of any development that's experiencing the downstream end of it will be continually experiencing those channel migration processes. And so what does that mean for the Grand Valley? We can talk about that, but this is the area that the river would be naturally moving within. The fluvial hazard buffer, again, it's just a margin off of the active stream corridor, and it's based on a factor of reach average channel width. So the studies, the protocol from the CWCV that establishes the methods for mapping this, identify different kinds of river systems and different kind of scaling factors for the fluvial hazard buffer, which were based on observational data of river movement into channel margins. So here we have an image of the Gunnison River and the fluvial hazard buffer. The widths that are going to change depending on the material type. So where we have fan material, so here's an alluvial fan, we have glacial or alluvial material that's been deposited by the river. If that's the valley margin, it's going to be more erodible. We're going to have a wider buffer. Where we have the channel farther away from the active stream corridor, in this case, the channel's on this side. Here, it's farther away. We have a narrower buffer in that same erodible material. And then finally, where we have valley margins that have more resistant materials, so we have a lot of mudstone, shale, sandstone, those are certainly more resistant to erosion. So the fluvial hazard buffer is going to be narrower in those locations simply because the valley margin material is more resistant. Geotechnical flags are really just, and it's these purple lines here. These are really just locations where we have hill slopes that extend beyond the fluvial hazard buffer. So we have the active stream corridor in yellow, the fluvial hazard buffer in orange, which extends beyond that. And then because we have a steep hill slope that kind of continues on beyond that, we want to acknowledge that there could be some potential hazards associated with eroding the valley margin that could affect the hill slopes beyond it. And so the geotechnical flag is simply just, hey, this is an area where additional hazards could exist uphill. We're not going in and doing any detailed evaluations here. We're just acknowledging that this is a potentially hazardous location. and that site scale types of development should take a closer look if they're near this zone on these hill slopes. We also identify fans. These could be debris fans or alluvial fans. And here's an example in the Colorado, Debet Canyon on the Colorado River. The fan is really it's just delineated by a point at the apex of the fan. And we're not going to delineate the extent of the fan because that's a complicated procedure. But fans can mean a lot of things for a river. In this case, this is a fan that's made of relatively fine material, and it's been building over probably tens of thousands of years, and it's impinging the river corridor. So it's essentially constraining the river and pushing it over on this side of the valley, which could focus erosive energy on the other side. We happen to have Interstate 70 on the other side, and so we'll leave that up to CDOT to deal with that. But we identify these fans as an additional hazard that could also influence the river corridor. So a little bit more about fluvial hazard zone mapping. We don't call it erosion hazard mapping simply because we're accounting for more than erosion in these processes. We're accounting for deposition, we're accounting for migration. And so it's all the processes that result in river movement over time or all at once during an event. And so this is especially important for our depositional reaches, where we could have during a really big flood event, a depositional zone that results in the channel moving quite dramatically to another side. So here's an image of the St. Vrain River where that happened on the Front Range in 2013. So erosion is just one process, and we identify through fluvial hazard zone mapping other geomorphic processes as well. Now, folks are going to be interested in how this compares to floodplain inundation mapping and models. Floodplain mapping, obviously we have a regulatory framework around that the county manages here, and those maps go through their own process. They're vetted, they're reviewed, and then established or adopted by a community and by FEMA. They represent where water goes at a certain frequency or probability, and that's going to be the pictures on the bottom. They represent inundation hazards, and they are based on a static river. They are based on LIDAR and cross sections that are taken from a point in time, and they don't account for the fact that rivers move over time. And so we've actually seen examples in Delta County where their floodplain map on the Gunnison, the river had migrated outside of the floodplain, and the active channel had moved beyond it. And so obviously that's why we do updates every so often. At the same time, they don't account for the fact that during really intense floods, the river can move just all at once, not over time. And so that's not going to play out necessarily in the Colorado River, although we could have a big flood event with a big channel migration associated with that. But certainly in smaller streams and steeper mountain communities, we can see debris flows and avulsions and stuff like that happening, where the river is actively changing over the course of a flood event. This is part of a fact sheet that I can send you guys, but it's just highlighting some specific differences between the two. Another thing is that the fluvial hazard zone map, it's not something that we have a regulatory framework for. That is something that each community decides of what they want to do, how they want to adopt it. Is it going to be incorporated into development review, into the floodplain permitting or not? Is it going to be, there's a lot of other applications, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. So it's just simply a voluntary program. When we went out to propose this project for the Grand Valley, I talked to most of you all about this, and this is something you support and kind of entertain how we could adopt this information into river management. And here's a comparison of an inundation extent in blue, where we would have a FEMA map delineate, and then the fluvial hazard zone in orange. The fluvial hazard zone could be broader than the inundation extent for, say, the 100-year flood event, for the 1% annual chance flood. However, not always. And so there are going to be cases where the floodplain, the inundation extent could be greater, especially where we have broader valleys that are shallower and wider, that sort of thing. So there's not always the fluvial hazard zone's bigger or wider, and it just depends on the valley type and slope and flood frequency. So a little bit about kind of some of the applications and benefits, and then I'll turn it over to Molly to give you guys a quick overview of things. So the primary benefit and why this came out is to think about hazard reduction, life and property impacts, and identify areas that are vulnerable to these fluvial geomorphic hazards, characterize them and plan for them. That could be through emergency response. It could be through, guiding development, siting infrastructure and the like. And ultimately this program came out of the 2013 flood event that was so catastrophic for the Front Range, and where we identified the need that like these FEMA maps aren't getting the whole picture, the whole hazard picture, because our rivers in Colorado are dynamic. But there's a lot of secondary benefits to that, and some of these things might have applications in the Grand Valley. This geomorphic floodplain within the active stream corridor can identify areas where we can accommodate channel migration and dynamism to support the complexity and habitat that is so vital in the Grand Valley. We can think about areas that are laterally connected and hydrologically connected to the river that can improve water quality by keeping those out of development. We can look for opportunities for open space and restoration projects as well that would benefit the species that depend on the river and riparian zone. We can also think about our infrastructure. We want to make sure that when we go in and replace and repair our utilities, we put them in safe places. And granted, we're not going to be able to do that everywhere for everything, but as future projects unfold, we can think about where the river could be moving over time and putting utilities in places that are going to be safer and less exposed to these migration hazards. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And if we think about the FHZ, so it's a fluvial hazard zone map, hazards, the kind of primary word in there, but we can think of it also as Chris Sturm of CWCB likes to call them fluvial opportunity zones. So where do we have opportunities to think about more compatible designs within the river, more compatible development, so that long-term we have a community that's connected with a river, that works with the river, and it's not always kind of combating the river. And so there's a lot of other things that can fall out of that, which a lot of these things we're going to be talking about in kind of future efforts to the River Corridor Initiative, which some of you are aware of, the Grand Valley River Corridor Initiative, which this fell out of. Ultimately, the fluvial geomorphic hazard zone, the fluvial hazard zone is not a new hazard that we're creating by creating these maps. And I can imagine that some of you are thinking about, community members, and are we going to be getting people pushing back on this? It's, ultimately these hazards exist, these processes exist. By mapping them, we're not creating new processes. And so as we have kind of more one-on-one discussions, we can think about how to communicate this and roll this out in the community in a way that's going to be most helpful and not cause a lot of whiplash. So there's a lot of opportunities there. We can provide information as layers that are, you're able to put up on publicly available GIS maps. We can talk about if and how we want to do that. And this also provides more kind of communication to communities. Do we have hazards that we might not have been aware of that we can prepare for, and think about opportunities to get different flood insurance, and also just kind of educate people on river processes as well. So here's a map from St. George, which is in Utah, a highly rapidly developing community that's got some dynamic rivers in it. They've experienced a lot of fluviogeomorphic hazards where the river has taken out big bluffs that we've had development on, and so homes are falling in the river. And St. George didn't like the look of that. They wanted it to be a friendly community, friendly for development, friendly for and safe for people. And so they've, over the years, developed an erosion hazard layer. That's what they call it right here. And it's this this black or dark blue line that shows areas that the river could be influencing. This is a different method that they've used in Utah, but it's very similar to what we're doing here in Colorado. So just a couple more details, and then I'll pass it over to Molly. We've got an FHZ map is ultimately this analysis, a planning level analysis. And what I mean by planning level is we're not doing detailed site-specific analysis. We're not going out and characterizing the valley margin material, over, each, foot of the river corridor. We did this mapping over, I think it's almost 50 miles. So we're relying on remotely sensed data we did go out in the field where we had questions about where to draw certain lines and kind of go out and look at things and identify, is this terrace a terrace or is it active? But ultimately we're relying on geology maps, LiDAR maps. And so there's an inherent resolution to that, which I estimate around 1 to 100 or 10 to 100 meters in terms of where is this line and am I in or out, that kind of thing. So I want to acknowledge that. And that's based on the scale of our geology and our LiDAR. So ultimately, it's not a site scale analysis. It's where we have parcels that are in the fluvial hazard zone. We might think about additional review or investigations to understand how that could play out with these river processes. But if we do have, for example, a home that's looking to build on the hill slope here and they're within the fluvial hazard buffer and they're worried about the channel eroding into that hill slope, well, let's do a more detailed analysis. Let's consult a geotechnical engineer and ask some harder questions for that site level analysis. So now I'm going to turn it over to Molly. And I'll stop sharing and she can open this web app that she's developed for us and give us a kind of high level review. And I'll just do a time check, Molly. We're at 4:15. I just need, I'd like to leave maybe 5 minutes at the end for some discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so we developed a little web app so you can view some of this data a little more easily as you review everything. So this is, when you put in that link, this is what you'll see. You'll see a little, the title, Draft Grand Valley Fluvial Hazard Zone Map with a disclaimer. And I'll just go through it a little bit just to show you what's here. So on the right hand, this is the legend of every layer that you have toggled on. So the legend, so that's really useful. And then right below that, there's a layer list that you can look at. And this is where you can toggle things on and off. So say you want to look at the historic river margins. We've got them all up here. And then you can also specifically look at just a few if you want. So that's pretty cool. There's a few things that will only pop up when you zoom in, for example, the REMs. And there's the slider tool, so you can slide the REM on and off to look over the LiDAR here. So that's just a cool tool. Yeah, so I guess zooming out, I'm kind of try not to make you all sick, zooming in and out too much. But here is basically our study area, right? Let's just split it up into generally 4 sections and we can kind of talk about some of the lines. So the first section we're going to talk about is from, this kind of canyon area, going from the start of our study region down to where it kind of opens up and goes into Palisade. So in this region, if you think back to what I was kind of talking about before, these kind of transport reaches, kind of confined reaches with, a little bit less complexity, that's what you're finding in this section of the region. And so the channel width is relatively low, and the active stream corridor compared to other sections of the valley are relatively narrow. And you can see here, like this boundary is following kind of I-70, right? And then the fluvial hazard buffer is also relatively narrow in many places. As Joel said, it kind of ranges between 0.25 channel widths and 1 channel width, depending on, what the erodibility of the margins are and how close the channel actually is to that. Here you can see this is about 1 channel width along the toe of this fan. And the active stream corridor isn't really, eroding into the span so much. So it's relatively narrow here. As you can see, we also have a few fans, as I mentioned. So this is a slightly more unconfined section of this these canyony reaches. And you can see there are a few tributaries with some fans here. And then you will also note there is a lot of purple in this section. So snaking along the fluvial hazard buffers, there are a lot of these geotechnical flags. Yeah. Okay, so quickly, trying to do this quickly. The next section, basically we can talk about is from where the river enters kind of Palisade, right, and travels down all the way to the Gunnison confluence. And so this area, you know, these sections are generally, you know, they have wider channel widths. It's a little more complex, right, than these canyon reaches. The active stream corridor is a little bit wider. Some sections are still a little narrow. For example, over here by Palisade, where it's kind of stuck on this meander. But there are, you know, some areas are much wider and have more, you know, more complexity, right? And the Fluvial hazard buffer on the southern end here, this bluff is all Mancus shale. And so generally the fluvial hazard buffer, we've kept at 0.5 channel widths. And the northern side is kind of on this more alluvial, colluvial stuff. So the fluvial hazard buffer is a little wider depending on where you are.
I just want to point out real quick that where we have gravel ponds, and this is based on observations in other rivers, where we have gravel ponds, that's an opportunity for the river to erode into and kind of capture those. And so you'll see some kind of funky lines around gravel ponds where we've incorporated those into the active stream corridor. And I just wanted to call that out because you know, those are really, they're not like FEMA certified levees that are put up there. These are areas where if we had a big flow event, there's a lot of opportunity for the river to kind of recapture those. And so that's why we extend it to those.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot in this section of the river. So yeah, there is some weird looking lines over here for sure. Yeah, and with the Mancus shale, there are definitely, you know, some mass wasting opportunities. There's some fans out here, and there's also some geotechnical flags. Okay, so we're going to split up the rest of the Colorado into one section from the confluence down to the Loma boat ramp or so. And this area is generally kind of similar to the previous area I was just talking about, but perhaps even a little bit more complex. So this is, you know, by Redlands Parkway, this is where we were showing that migration example, but there's a lot of, you know, complex areas, and the active stream corridor is generally a little wider, and even the channel width is a little wider, probably because of that Gunnison confluence there, sourcing water and sediment. But yeah, you can see here, this is a pretty wide active stream corridor, although you can see, yes, there are gravel ponds there. And this fluvial hazard buffer here, it kind of ranges, but there's a lot going on there with the geology, but generally, the fluvial hazard buffer is about 0.5, but it does depend where you are. And the northern boundary is about 0.5 to 1 channel widths, similar to the previous section. What's really interesting about this area is there are two disconnected active stream corridors. So remember, the disconnected stream corridors are where, you know, you would expect that to be part of the geomorphic floodplain, but maybe, you know, it's being disconnected by something, in this case, the highway. So this is a really interesting example right here. Yeah, there's a lot going on here, but you can see that the highway is cutting through this area that was definitely historically active, and even now today still has this side channel going through it. And so that's something important to note.
I wanted to make another point about that one, Molly, real quick, if you don't mind zooming back. And the protocol for Colorado essentially says there's a couple things that can essentially cut off an active stream corridor, and that is a major highway, including an interstate or, you know, U.S. highway, that kind of thing, or a certified levee, FEMA certified levee. And the idea there is that these are infrastructure that we know, you know, people are kind of committed to maintaining. Here we have a side channel that actually goes through the highway, and so we kind of went back and forth on this, but because there's still active processes occurring associated with this side channel where we could still have continued migration, we included the active stream corridor. is not being disconnected by part of this, and it could certainly influence this gravel pond as well. And then we said the rest of it beyond that would be disconnected. So this one's a little bit of a complicated example.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, and then, there's some cool fans out here. There's this really big fan over here. Generally, yeah, there's some good amount of fans and geotechnical flags in this area. So, okay, last one. We will lump all of the Gunnison in one to talk about right now. Generally, these reaches are mostly confined, but there are some pockets of, kind of unconfined areas where the rivers had a chance to move in the past. So you can see by Whitewater here, the active stream corridor is generally a little bit wider. As you can see, there's also some gravel ponds. And then as you travel downstream, the active stream corridor gets pretty narrow, right? And there's not as much complexity in the stream corridor, although there are a few, bars and islands, which is cool. There's fans, and in this area, the geology is really complex in this area. There's a lot going on, and so the fluvial hazard buffer was an interesting one to delineate here, but it depends, it does range throughout the reaches between 0.25 channel widths and one example of where it's one channel width is over here. So there's more like, colluvial material. Yeah. And then, here's where it's a little bit narrower. It's right up against this valley margin that is probably a slightly more, resistant material. So, and then throughout we have some of these geotechnical flags, more gravel ponds, and then we have the confluence with Colorado. So, yes, that is, in a very small nutshell, that is our study area, and this is the map that you can use. So, yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Molly. And so we've sent out the link for that. If anyone has trouble with that, let us know. I believe Esri requires you to create a free account to access that map. So let us know if you have any problems, and we can walk you through that if we need to. So Molly, if you wouldn't mind stopping that, and then I'll just have one more slide for you all, and we can kind of round this out. So let's get on down. Great. So just quickly on next steps. This meeting, our intention here is to present the draft maps. We have a report that I emailed out that kind of gives a lot more of the background that we talked about up front, and then also kind of reach specific information. What's going on in these reaches geomorphically? What are the numbers behind the things that we're delineating? So I want you all to be able to take some time to digest that. And within 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I'm going to try to reach out to you all and have some one-on-one meetings and kind of come into your offices and discuss and sit down and go over questions. If you would like to submit comments, we would love your comments and feedback. And so I've attached a spreadsheet that has kind of a format for how to do that. And that can be based on the maps, that can be based on the report. We're going to be having a third party review this. And so other fluvial geomorphologists are going to take a look at what we've done and kind of dig through it and provide us comments as well. So kind of that expert technical feedback. Over the next 2 months, I'll be working with Molly to develop applications of this. Okay, what would this look like on the ground, and how can we use this to inform our management of the river corridor? And that could be specific projects, priorities, management actions, that sort of thing. Those would also come out of discussions with you all. And so looking for feedback on that. So once we kind of go through that round of comment and review, then we can present the final maps and applications in January. So there's still some work that we'll need to do behind the scenes, and also in coordination with you all to get us to the final steps here. And then kind of beyond that, like what do we do with that? What are the next steps? That's just going to be an ongoing conversation within the communities, and the River Corridor Initiative is interested in that question as well, and hope to be continuing to work with you all on kind of down the road over the next couple years, like what could this mean for managing the river corridor? So I'll stop there. We've kind of reached the end of our hour, but I'm happy to hang out and take any questions and just talk about this and next steps and all that.
Well, this is Ann. I don't have any questions, but I really appreciate you guys presenting this. It was very well articulated and took a lot of complex information and presented it well. So thank you
Thanks,
for
Ann.
prepping and presenting. I think this is a really important project for our community. So I appreciate you guys taking it on. Gives us some good
Absolutely.
to think about.
Great. I hope everyone's got a little, a little primer in fluid geomorphology coming out of this.
Molly and Joel, I'm sorry if I missed this, but what does REM stand for and DEM again?
Yeah, good question. REM, so DEM stands for Digital Elevation Model. It's basically, yeah, we can use it to look at the topography. And then a relative elevation model is what REM stands for. And so basically a relative elevation model kind of takes that digital elevation model and normalizes it to the lowest point in the stream channel, basically. So basically all of the elevation points that you get in that REM are relative to the stream channel.
And Molly, if you don't mind, we can take some more questions, but pulling up the web app and just showing the scale for that relative elevation model, just to kind of demonstrate that. That was an important tool that we use to identify the different components of the floodplain and what's going to be connected hydrologically and geomorphically.
Yeah, like right here, you can see there's a lot of complexity, on this little floodplain. So on the left here is that REM, the relative elevation model, which is a cool color scheme. And then the right here is that digital elevation model pulled from LiDAR.
And do you mind pulling the legend up too, just to show the
Yeah,
different
yeah.
elevations? Because we've got that
Oh,
color
yeah,
coded.
there we go. Yeah.
And those are the elevations relative to the nearest channel bottom, essentially. So
Yeah.
if you're, blue, you're at the channel bottom or below, and then all the way up to like 12. And this is in feet. So, 12 feet is the orange, burgundy, that kind of thing above the channel. So for the comment sheet, I organize it in a way where it's like, okay, if you've got some questions or comments about a particular reach or, a delineation or a boundary or, what's going on here, that's the opportunity to kind of identify that. Which reach is it? Where's some location information? And then you can put screenshots in there, that sort of thing. So definitely want to give you all the opportunity to kind of dig into this and review this, and then provide some questions as we go. So we had a question about, so we don't have bathymetry, John. This is all based on the LiDAR. So that's going to be some interpolated top of water surface, or, however the LiDAR is done, right? There's going to be no data where the water is. And so they interpolate across from that. So we're just taking that kind of surface of the water. And I wish REMs were as cool as the bands, but maybe some of us think they are. Yeah. And I'll just kind of put out there for the group that there's actually a tool in ArcGIS and Pro and ArcMap, or desktop, that allow you to generate these REMs, and Molly actually helped develop that and vet it. So we have a tool out there that can do these based on cross sections in the river. And Carrie had a question about reaches cut off from the Colorado River. And Carrie, are you talking about actually identifying like the footprint of the side channels or former reaches of the river? Like
Yeah, correct. So I know that you mentioned a few of them that had been cut off from the river, but there's I think a lot more that we might know internally that I'm not sure if you guys are aware of.
Yeah, it'd be great to kind of sit down and look at that with you all. And when I talked about follow-up meetings, you know, you guys are high on my list of people. I mean, all the people on this call, I want to be able to follow up with you all individually. So coming over to Mesa County and just kind of talking over things, that could be one of the things we go over. I think in the active stream corridor, we try to capture areas that had been connected, at least in recent history hydrologically. But yeah, if we've missed anything, we definitely want that input from you all. Because yeah, where the river's been, it tends to want to go back to.